right, welcome back to Next Gen Console Watch, the show following everything happening with the latest gaming hardware. I'm Stella Chung, filling in for Daemon today, and joining me are Max Scoville from Podcast Beyond.
Hello. Hey, Stella.
And Ryan McCaffrey from our Unlocked podcast.
Hello, hello.
It's pretty fun we get two Xbox representatives today. That feels really good, but also a little bit nefarious.
No fair. I can't stand for it. I have nothing but good things to say about Sony week after week, and I'm going to be outnumbered this time around. I don't know what to say.
It's about time. So this week's topic was a little bit, I remember we sat in the meeting and we kind of tossed around different ideas. And I think we finally settled on this question of, has this console generation already peaked? It's not a great feel-good question, but also I think it's something that a lot of people have been thinking about, especially since, just to name a few of the games that have come from this generation, I mean, there's Alan Wake 2, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, if you remember that game, kind of came and went.
Looks great.
Yeah. Assassin's Creed Mirage. Oh, God, do you remember Callisto Protocol?
That was a game.
No, I mean, yes,
it came out.
Yeah, but actually what surprised me was that Deathloop was on this generation, and I had totally forgotten about that. Same with Guardians of the Galaxy, It Takes Two, Resident Evil 2 and 3, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and The Man Who Erased His Name. But we were looking back at all of these different games, and we thought, it's not really this impressive list, and a lot of them are things that have been updated for recent consoles. Specifically, Ryan and I were talking about, hey, was there a launch game for Xbox Series? And we couldn't think of any.
Not an exclusive one. Everything was cross-gen for a while.
Yeah. So what is your answer to, or what are your thoughts on if this console generation has already peaked, Max?
Well, it's a tricky one because I feel like it's less that this console generation has peaked and more the fact that this console, like the hardware has gotten so powerful that developing games for it is, I would say, prohibitively expensive. You know, when you've got a smaller install base of new hardware and games are, immensely risky and expensive, prohibitively so to develop, and there's a massive install base for last gen, you're kind of leaving money on the table if you're not just kind of targeting that big huge group of customers who have hardware sitting there. And sure, the PS4 and the Xbox One, even with the upgraded kind of mid-gen refresh models, they're still you're still targeting like 12-year-old hardware at this point. And there's the little elephant in the room, which is the Switch, which I imagine that if you can make a game that can run on a PS4, it's probably not the end of the world to squeeze it on the Switch at some point. Whereas if you're trying to make something that is running on all cylinders on the newest, most high-tech, high-end hardware, really just pushing it to its limits, it's less that you're seeing hardware restrictions and more monetary, logistical, manpower restrictions.
Yeah, how about you, Ryan? Do you agree with Max's statements?
Yeah, Max, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's almost this like weird catch-22 that's not, it's not the hardware's fault or the hardware maker's fault. It's just, like I said, it's a greater industry issue of, in a way, the technology could, or the games could kind of progress well or faster maybe from a technological perspective when we did do these forced resets at the beginning of every generation, because it was like, well, there is no such thing as backwards compatibility going from Nintendo to Super Nintendo to N64 to GameCube. So yeah, we're gonna throw everything out, and we know that we've just got to make great games to sell hardware, which will then make us money. But now, with the economics of gaming being what they are, you're in this situation where you're right. You can't leave behind a 9-figure number of people. It's like 150 million people between the PS4 and the Xbox One. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea of leaving all of that behind to go and do something exclusively for PS5 and or the Series X is a tricky proposition. And yeah, it's the getting back to the core question of, has this generation peaked? I mean, I think we'll get to that. I have thoughts on it, but my initial reaction is it's a depressing question to even be asking. We're not even 4 years in. We're 3 3/4 years in or so here. And Stella, it's a pretty depressing question to me, because I think it's because the answer isn't a definitive, no, of course it hasn't. Like, the answer is maybe or yes, depending on how you want to argue it.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a very sad and depressive thing to think about, but it's interesting because I feel like since the consoles did launch during COVID, I feel like they lost at least 2 years, right? That they could have been developing games. And I mean, we didn't see them eventually catch up exactly 2 years after. So I feel like we just weren't ready for this generation quite yet. Like, if they had actually waited 2 more years, I think maybe it would have given developers time to actually work with the tech, figure out what could work and what wouldn't. It's really interesting because Ubisoft specifically spoke on Assassin's Creed Shadows, saying that we're pushing the limits of what we can do. So it's interesting because I feel like developers were already kind of struggling with console versus PC power. And then now they have this really powerful console that they have to try and account for, while also, making sure that people on previous gen still can enjoy things. I mean, the biggest developers that I can think of that kind of made that mistake was definitely with Cyberpunk when it launched, and the previous gen performance was just awful. Max, specifically, I remember on the PS4.
It was rough. Like, I also think that CDPR primarily operates as a PC game company. And I think they have a very kind of old school sensibility when it comes to making games, and not in a bad way necessarily, but I believe they really are all about like pushing the hardware to its utmost limitations. And seeing those E3 tech demos back when E3 was a thing, showing off what, a vertical slice of Cyberpunk, it was mind-boggling in a way that we don't really get so much anymore. We get this vertical slice of a game, and it was admittedly probably selling more sizzle than steak and set some unrealistically high expectations. But sure enough, 2 years after the game launched, it actually launched, and we got Phantom Liberty, which was the next-gen game it should have been. Cyberpunk was announced in 2013. Cyberpunk was announced, I believe, like before the PS4 generation even started. It's funny, we talk about the hardware peaking, or the games peaking for a generation. When developers get their hands on new hardware, it takes them a minute to figure out how to use it. And that's frequently when we get the best games of a generation. They're usually not launch titles. Usually they're the ones that come at the tail end, partially because developers had a chance to figure out how to make games for this hardware, and also because they probably have a little bit more walking around money, and they're able to be like, hey, this game has the potential to sell for this many units, so they could probably. I'm kind of spitballing here. I'm again, we're armchair quarterbacks on this show, but if you've got a massive install base of hundreds of thousands, you've got this potential to sell this many units. It's I guess the ceiling's a little bit higher on what can be expected of it. And it's weird to talk about this generation peaking when GTA 6 is right around the corner, which I'm pretty sure we're going to see a massive bump in an install base, or at least a sizable bump for one game coming out. That is going to be one of the best-selling games in history. I don't think that's a ludicrous prediction to make. I think that, Ryan, I think you agree with me on that, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was heading too, because we were talking in our meeting ahead of this episode, and from a tech perspective, I've said this before, I still personally, and it's subjective because there are different visual styles, but I still have not seen a video game that looks better than Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. I think it's absolutely stunning game. I mean, visually, but also it's also a great video game. And that was in the first year of the PS5. And with Xbox, we only finally just this year got a truly jaw-dropping, oh wow, this is a stunning next-gen Series X only game, Series X and S, and that's Hellblade 2. Hellblade 2 didn't quite deliver as much as I would have liked on the gameplay front. Good game, just I wouldn't call it a great game, but it is absolutely stunning to look at. But you're absolutely right, Max. It's GTA 6 is going to, I mean, we don't quite know how it's going to go technologically. Rockstar has traditionally made pretty darn good-looking games, even if they aren't, you wouldn't necessarily call them the best-looking games in the industry, but they're also so layered with rich detail that you have to account for that as well. But you're so right that GTA 6 is going to be a massive spike. All these people that have stayed back on PS4 and Xbox One, a lot of them are going to come along and finally move up to the PS5 and Series X when GTA 6 finally drops.
Yeah, so actually, I can't remember what we were talking about, Ryan, when you did say that you might potentially play GTA 6 on PS5 versus Xbox. I forget what the factor was, but this was like
The
one of
Pro.
the yes,
The
that's
Pro,
right.
yeah, I
Yeah.
will. I've said I hold to that. I will 100% buy a PS5 Pro just for GTA 6. I'll just trade this one in, and whatever the difference is because that there isn't a PC version day one to throw my PC at it. So that game is. I'm such a huge GTA fan, and it now only comes around once a decade, or really longer, even more longer than that. So yeah, I will go to whatever ends I need to go to get the best GTA experience I can get. Now, not everybody's going to feel that way, but yeah, that's how big of a GTA fan I am.
Yeah, okay. I couldn't remember the exact conversation that we had, but I'm glad you brought that back up. But because I'm curious, do you feel like a pro console at this point would help, or would that just further the divide between developers and the tech that they're already just now starting to grab this concept of? Max, how do you think that would help at all, or do you think that would just
we don't need a PS5 Pro. Like, I'm just gonna throw that out there. It would be cool in the same like the way I look at it is, those cars that go 500 miles an hour that you can maybe drive for 5 minutes on the autobahn.
Yep.
When do you get to drive it? You need, like, it's not so much the limitations of the car, it's the limitations of the driver and the road. And that's kind of where we're at right now. You can have the most powerful hardware imaginable, but it's a flex. What are you going to run on it? Like, it's the people who get the most souped up PCs possible, and they just wind up playing Vampire Survivors. Like, that's a running joke. People play like Balatro or whatever. Like, it's like the fun of a game is not inherently tied to its hardware specs or its processing power or its graphics or anything like that. It's and this is heavily demonstrated left and right by Nintendo, who put out like an Android tablet 9 years ago or whatever, and it's still selling like hotcakes. But yeah, I don't know. It would be cool to see a PS5 Pro that does a few little things and just tightens up the graphics on level 3 or whatever you want to call it. But it just seems like it's another variable, and there's already so many variables. And when you're dealing with games of this scale, trying to get a game to function on one hardware model is enough trouble. Trying to make a game, period, is an immensely complex thing to do. And then to be like, okay, well, it's got to work on the Xbox Series X and S, so that's a little two-pronged thing right there. And then the PS5. But then what if there's a PS5 Pro? But then of course there's PC, and then it keeps going. It's a whole can of worms over there. I mentioned this earlier, but the sort of funny little other like dark horse element here is, what happens if the Switch 2 or the Super Switch or whatever the next Switch is called is more or less on par with I feel like if PS4 Pro, Xbox One X is even unrealistic in terms of where the hardware would be at. But what if it's comparable with last gen? What if games that ran well on last gen can be, for lack of a better word, dragged and dropped onto this new piece of hardware? Because the Switch 2 is inevitably going to sell really, really well. And I don't see a world where GTA 6 comes to the next Nintendo console. But what if they put out one that could run GTA 5 really well, and suddenly that gets a whole new lease on life, forever preventing us from ever getting any story DLC for any future GTA games, just continuing to print money in Los Santos over there. But there's all these games that have been made for last gen over the last 10 years and change, that could suddenly find a whole new audience if they were able to run well on the next Nintendo hardware, which again, Nintendo is marching to the beat of their own drum. So we're over here being like, what about a PlayStation 5 Pro? What about a Super Xbox Series XXX or whatever? Like, we don't need that. That's, if anything, that's making more challenges for developers. I would say it's more work to make a game that takes advantage of something more powerful than it is to take a game that's finished and try to figure out how to shoehorn it onto something that is maybe slightly less powerful. And I'm basing this on the fact that we see, I don't know, The Witcher 3 got put on Switch, which is still mind-boggling to me. The one of the best games of this current gen that was touted left and right as a next-gen exclusive was Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which is, oh, by the way, coming to Xbox One and PS4, I believe, next month. So yeah. I don't know how that's going to work, but I imagine it's, you see this, people getting games running on like potato mode or like the super low res, low settings PC mod kind of thing. I think it's probably easier to sort of strip something down than it is to build something from the ground up, or to try to really just expand it, or to make it more complex. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think next gen is the answer. I think optimizing for current gen and last gen.
To come back to your point on the PS5 Pro, which is the only heavily rumored mid-gen upgrade device we've heard about so far, I have to think that the sales potential, the ceiling of a PS5 Pro, is probably lower than what the PS4 Pro's ceiling was, because at least back then you could sell the idea of 4K, even though PS4 Pro didn't deliver very much native 4K, but that was still the marketing reason to push it. Now, what are you selling, and especially when the PS4 Pro was $400, and now the PS5 Pro, if in fact it's real, as everything seems to point to, it's going to be $550, probably $600, and there's no obvious here's what you're getting. There's no 8K or 4K 60 for everything. It's really going to be interesting to see what the victory condition is for Sony with the PS5 Pro. Now, I mean, that's their business certainly, but from where we sit here, it is kind of, I scratch my head wondering about it. And again, I say that as someone who will buy one if it's real, just for GTA 6. But how many of us are out there? I would argue not that many of us are out there. I mean, will some of those fence sitters that we were talking about that haven't come to this generation yet, that haven't bought a PS5 or a Series X, will they just go and pick up PS5 Pros? Maybe, but that's still a big investment to go.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been sitting it out for these first 4 years, are you gonna make that $600 leap? Maybe, but yeah it's. The economics of the industry just get weirder by the day.
I mean, just looking at the things that the jump. I mean, looking at the jump for the PS4 to the PS4 Pro to the PS5, like what is the PS5 unable to do that we want it to do? The 4K HDR thing was a big selling point for the PS4 Pro. That's what convinced me to get one. That's what got me excited about that. Having a bigger hard drive is cool too. A little bit better processing. In the case of the PS5, it launched. The launch models have a little 8K logo on the box. No one has an 8K TV. Maybe Drake, I don't know. But they actually went ahead and they took the 8K logo off of the boxes, I believe. And it still presumably outputs 8K if you can find something that can input 8K. It's just there's where we're going, we don't need roads. It's just it's not there yet. So what is the selling point for is there a new level to HDR? Is there 4D surround sound? There's nothing to justify a mid-grade up fresh, or what do we call it? The 5.5 models. We don't need that. And so to kind of tie this back to what we're talking about, I don't think that it's so much that this generation has peaked. It's more that this generation has called into a lot of questions that inherent issues with console generations entirely as a whole.
Presented by NHTSA. If you love driving, games like F1, Horizon Chase, and Expeditions, a Mud Runner game, let you live out some of your wildest dreams behind the wheel. But in real life, even the smallest bad decisions can end in tragedy. If you're feeling a little high or stoned, never get behind the wheel. Your friends, family, and especially law enforcement can tell that you've been driving high. Always remember, if you feel different, you drive different. Never drive high. The psychoactive component of marijuana can slow reaction times, impair cognitive performance, and make it more difficult to keep a steady lane position. Always remember, drive high, get a DUI.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of it's not the tech is fine. It's just we can't do anything with it, and we're just now catching up to figuring out what we can do. So I agree. I don't think this generation has peaked. If anything, I think we can build up to peak eventually in the next few years. But it's kind of wild that it is going to be in the next few years, right? As opposed to what the timeline was like for the previous gen. And I mean, that makes me pretty excited for the future of this current generation of consoles, because I was thinking while you guys were talking, I was like, man, how many games have I really played on my consoles that I couldn't play on my PC, which I've absolutely souped up. It's great. And I do play Vampire Survivors on it, and it's amazing.
It's a good game. It's great.
I take offense, but whatever. But it is interesting because I'm like, a lot of these games I've been able to play on PC, and I haven't felt like I've missed out on a specific game. I mean, the biggest game of, I think, the last 2 years has been Elden Ring, right? Especially with the DLC now. You've been able to play that on any platform of your choice without a specific up or downside to choosing a different platform. So it's really interesting that we are now in this era of gaming where it's like, whatever you want, it's fine. But it does kind of speak to, I do understand why fans of each platform are very upset that they don't seem to have a specific reason to stick to the platform. And speaking of the sales, it is interesting because PS5 sales are down and Xbox sales are also really slow. And I mean, I think we expected this, especially since it did come out during the pandemic. A lot of people weren't able to afford it or even get their hands on it because of all the scalpers. But Sony did lower their overall sales target for the PS5 from 21 million units to 18. And the Xbox Series X and S sales are keeping pace with the 360 in terms of life-to-date sales, but they are still behind the PS5 and Switch, which I don't even know we should put the Switch into this because it's their own entire ecosystem. I don't even, when people think of the major gaming systems, I'm like, okay, well, the Switch is obviously leading in their own area. Which I think we were talking about. Would a Switch coming out with a new handheld, which obviously they're not going to go away from the handheld, do you think that would bring people away from other platforms or no? If they were able to host the different games that are available on the Xbox and, the PlayStation?
I don't think so. Nintendo has always marched to the beat of its own drum, and it's got its own fans. And I think probably a lot of us own a Nintendo and one or more of the other consoles. So yeah, regardless of what the Super Switch is capable of from a technological perspective, I don't see it really affecting Sony or Microsoft or vice versa, really. But Max makes a good point that it does open up. I mean, maybe if indeed it's PS4 level power in the Super Switch, then publishers can go back to the well, take all those games that they've already made money on Xbox One and PS4, get them onto the Super Switch, and let their main development teams finally actually move on to develop proper Series X and PS5 games. Because, yeah, it's my ultimate answer to this question of has this generation peaked already? It's no, but it's not the developer's fault, or it's these economic handcuffs that have kind of prevented this generation from yet reaching its peak, but in a bad way. Like we should be surging towards it. Instead, we're kind of crawling slowly up the mountain, and we all want to see that progression go faster.
We did an April Fool's video a few years ago where everything is coming to Switch, and it got increasingly weird. But a good deal of the games that got listed in that joke video shortly thereafter got announced for Switch. Like a lot of the stuff that seemed like completely pie in the sky, impossible, never going to be on Switch, got shoved onto Switch. Ryan, we were talking about this, but the prospect of like when will Microsoft announce this rumored handheld? And I think the smart move is to wait until Nintendo shows its hand and then tailor the messaging around that. Because if it comes down to it, if it's like the holiday rush next year and it's you're looking at a contest between an Xbox handheld that plays basically any Xbox games through smart delivery on the go, including your entire library,
right?
Or a souped up Switch, that is actually kind of a tough call right there, which gets interesting. And then who knows what Sony will be selling? I don't know. A controller with headphones built in or something. But yeah, it's a weird console generation. Not particularly weird in an exciting way, just kind of wonky. Got off on the wrong foot, and it's still kind of stumbling.
Max, would you call this the weirdest console generation of your lifetime, or has there been one weirder? Because I think this might be the weirdest one for me.
Yeah,
I think motion controls were pretty weird there.
That's fair.
Things got pretty wonky. The Kinect and the Wii, and then hands-free 3D being a brief thing, sort of. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember playing Call of Duty on the Wii with the weird little funky controller setup where it looks like a gun. I hated it. It was awful. Would not recommend. So I'm glad we're past that motion control. So I feel like an Xbox handheld would actually do a lot for Xbox players, at least for that platform, just because I know a lot of people want to be able to play a lot of games on the go, you know, not necessarily sit on the couch for things, maybe just play. I don't know, there's a lot of great indie games specifically on Game Pass that a lot of people, including me, would love to play on a handheld. So I feel like that would generate interest in that specific platform quite a bit. But I mean, it's rumored, don't know if it's going to happen. And even if so, that's not going to help the Xbox Series X platform any. So I don't know. But I am curious, what are your favorite, most impressive games on these platforms, like this gen so far? And I can start with Max.
That's like exclusive to this gen. I mean, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a good one. Demon's Souls is stunning. Demon's Souls is beautiful, and then I feel like the gameplay of that feels rigid compared to more recent FromSoft games because it is the skeletons, I guess, of a PS3 game. Alan Wake, one of the most beautiful looking games to date, and a lot of that though is also Remedy's just stellar art direction.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's we don't need to see that guy. We don't need to show that
Oh,
naked dude.
what
We
is
get
that?
Get that guy out of here. No, I don't. Yeah. Again, nothing has blown me away in that sort of whoa, next gen is here kind of way. Hellblade 2, one of the best looking games I've ever seen in action. But literally playing that game it starts out at least as kind of an uphill battle. Like you're like trudging along. Like it's very much it is been divisive because it's not. That's a cinematic, heart-wrenching experience, but is it a fun video game? ? Yeah, I don't know. It all depends what we're after. Again, the real MVP here is stuff like Balatro. That's the real banger game. No, I don't know. When I think about what are my favorite games of this generation, most of them are cross-gen. Like Elden Ring, incredible, also PS4 game. Yakuza Infinite Wealth, also PS4 game. It's like it's a trick question.
That's fair. Ryan?
I mean, Max listed a bunch of good ones. I could throw on a game that we have brought up already, the Phantom Liberty, Cyberpunk, the next-gen only expansion. Another cross-gen one that looks and plays great on the Series X, Forza Horizon 5, IGN's Game of the Year for 2021. That's just awesome. But yeah, it is just a strange... It's the weirdest generation. I will go with that. But yeah, I'm ready to fast forward to GTA 6. I mean, the good news is there's some good stuff coming out. I mean, we are heading into, at least on the Xbox side. I know Sony's been a little quieter lately. They've got Concord, but kind of not much else in the immediate first party pipeline. But really looking forward to Indiana Jones, presumably this fall, unless we get a delay announcement at Gamescom next week. But indies should be great. I don't know, technologically quite what that'll be, but machine games have always looked really good. Of course, Doom: The Dark Ages, that's high on my personal list, and that's gonna look. It already looks great. I mean, we've seen some gameplay of it. So, Fable looks stunning. That's presumably their big fall game next year, since they did mention 2025. There is plenty coming up, but yeah, GTA is going to be the big one, I think, from an overall technology perspective, just sort of like Max said, art direction, tech, layers of detail in the world, and then also the sales, the sales magnitude of it, of bringing in those people that still had not yet purchased a new gen console.
Yeah, that's fair. I think thinking of my own favorite games this gen, I think would be the Dead Space remake for sure, because I love that it kept to the old mechanics and everything that made that game great, but they just upped the graphics, which make it look so much scarier and better. And also, I was very taken by... I played this because it came with it, but playing Astrobot, I was actually really impressed by all of the different features and just how good of a platform puzzle game it was on its own, too, as a demo. And yeah, I was very impressed with that. But I mean, those aren't really games that you're like, oh, you should get this console for this. So it is a very weird generation. But it's not necessarily a bad one. Yeah, look at this. It was such a great little surprise, and I'm glad that it's become its own, like, it has its own fan base now.
You know, the downside of that game is it's like $400 or $500 to get it.
Yeah, that's true.
But of course, I don't know how you'd play it if you didn't have a PlayStation, so it's sort of a catch-22.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very expensive game, but it's a very good game. So there's that. So last week, which I was not here for, but you put out a poll, which was, what is a dead genre you'd like to see return? And we have the results, and the very top one, by winning by 28.7%, is music/rhythm, like Rock Band games, which makes sense. The second was action sports, like NBA Jam, which was 25%, so very close. Then extreme sports, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, 18.7%. Light gun, which House of the Dead, love that. Typing of the Dead is honestly my favorite variant, but it was 17.5%. And I don't know if this is real. Shmups, is that real?
Shoot 'em ups.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. 5.7%. And then Toys to Life, like the Skylanders, was 4.4%. So, yeah, that was, oh my God, that was 24,818 total voters. That's awesome. So
That's a fairly even breakdown of the top four, and then just a real brutal blow to shmups and Toys to Life.
Yeah. I feel like Pear was probably the Toys to Life. That he was all 4% of them, you know? So next week's poll is, what's your favorite modern console generation? So you've got the options of the PS2, Xbox, GameCube, or 360, PS3, the Wii, or PS4, Xbox One, or finally the PS5, Xbox Series, and Nintendo Switch. So very excited to see how that turns up. So make sure to vote at IGN.com the day this episode goes live. And I think that about does it for this very weird, but also oddly nostalgic and happy episode of Next Gen Console Watch. So thank you so much, Ryan and Max, for joining me today and for having me on as your guest host. My name is Stella, and we'll be back next week with more on the latest in gaming hardware. We'll see you then.